Litigation continues over risk corridor payments. We're going to get you up to speed of where things stand right now. But first, let's refresh our memory of what we're talking about with risk corridor payments. Now, this was one of the 3 R's in the Affordable Care Act of ways to stabilize the marketplace: risk corridors, risk adjustment, and reinsurance, envisioned in the Affordable Care Act as a way to cushion insurance companies against extreme losses or gains. Their payment to insurance companies through the health reform program, intended to protect insurers who had a larger, sicker pool than some of those other insurance pools with other plans that might have been a little healthier. So you can see how there might be an impact of having a sicker risk pool, and to compensate, these payments were coming to the insurance companies to level the playing field. It's meant to be temporary and work alongside reinsurance and other market stabilization measures. Now, in the original statute, risk corridor payments were not required to net zero. And that's a distinction that's been argued about over time, so much so that in 2015 and 2016, there were appropriation bills where Congress changed that and said it has to be budget neutral. That means insurers could not exceed collection. Payments to insurers could not exceed collections from other insurance companies. You had to equal zero. CMS cannot transfer funds from other programs or payment sources to pay the risk corridor program. So money would be collected, go to the feds would reimburse the insurance companies that needed the help. The feds could not take money from other sources if they didn't collect enough money to pay those insurance companies. So why the lawsuit? Well, because the feds never paid. They pointed to that budget neutral language saying, hey, we're not collecting enough, therefore we don't have to pay you anything. Insurers sued, as you can imagine, seeking the money, and we're talking about $12 billion. You can see why this became a fight right out of the gate. Lower courts actually split on whether or not these insurers were owed these payments. The appeals court for the Federal Circuit back in June was divided, but said ultimately no money was owed. The majority concluded that the feds were actually obligated under the Affordable Care Act to make risk corridor payments, but the obligation was later limited by those congressional appropriation riders, so therefore no money owed. Yes, there's an obligation, but those congressional appropriation riders say it has to be budget neutral, therefore no money owed. So let's fast forward. Late July, 2 insurers filed petitions to have their cases reheard en banc. And an en banc review means a review by the full panel of judges on the Federal Circuit. So not just that selection of a few judges as was heard in the original case, but they want the whole circuit to hear it. It's a request that comes up from time to time. It's not very common. In this review request, they argued that the Federal Circuit opinion conflicted with existing Supreme Court precedent. So they're saying there's an interesting legal question here and there's conflict, and therefore you should take this up and decide it. The interesting question: can appropriation riders amend the federal government's financial obligation under a federal statute? An interesting legal question, and one the insurers want this court to figure out. Well, the Department of Justice asked the feds, don't grant this review. They've been arguing, no, just leave it as it stands. As you can see, they don't want to pay the $12 billion. Now it actually is up to the federal court about whether or not they're going to grant this extra full panel review to see if that lower court decision is appropriate or if the insurers are owed their money. And again, we're talking about $12 billion. You can read up on this. You can actually read those petitions for en banc review as filed by the insurance companies. You can also read more on risk corridors overall to get a little better understanding about how those payments are supposed to work in theory. You can send us your questions about the Affordable Care Act, market stabilization measures, or other topics at healthwatchwisconsin.org.